Hi, everybody. Welcome back to this series of conversations about what we can do to live happier, better lives so we can use the science of happiness to lift each other up and to live the lives that we really want to live and pass on these ideas to others. And today I'm just thrilled to have this conversation about my favorite topic with one of my favorite people, Dr. Vivek Murthy, who's the Surgeon General of the United States. Vivek Murthy is the Surgeon General for President Biden. He was also the Surgeon General for President Obama. So it's his second pass through the District of Columbia Penitentiary of the federal government, and doing so happily and with a really wonderful spirit. And it's living testament to the idea that when you serve other people, you truly serve yourself. And we've become friends over the years, going back to when he was in his first tour through. And I'm delighted to see you again, Vivek. Welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you so much, Arthur. It's always a treat to talk to you. So thank you for inviting me on.
I'm so impressed, by the humanity that you're bringing to this important job, because you're asking the most interesting questions that Surgeon Generals, is it Surgeon Generals or Surgeons General?
Surgeon General, the second, yeah.
Yeah, the surgeons, just like attorneys general, I suppose. Yeah, the surgeons general rarely ask. I mean, it tends to be kind of a functional job about making sure that people, drive safely and don't smoke, et cetera. But you've taken it to a level of human flourishing that I don't think we've ever seen before in the role of the surgeon general. And I'm amazed by that and heartened by that, I have to say. I mean, I'm an unalloyed fan, but there are a couple of things in particular I want to talk about today that I think could be really useful to people in their own lives and alert them to some cautions that I think that are important in their lives today as well. You put out a couple of advisories recently, and it reminds me of the early 60s, which I wasn't around for the early 60s, but, we certainly know that the big things that were coming out of the Surgeon General's office in the 1960s, specifically, cancer is a big problem and smoking causes cancer. Well, you've been talking about, I don't know how good the parallel is, but you've been talking about loneliness and especially teen mental illness and social media. This is tricky, and I know it can be controversial, and we need to talk about this because, we have kids and we have people that we love and we want to keep everybody safe. So can we talk about loneliness and social media today?
Absolutely. We can talk about whatever you want, Arthur.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's not an idle comparison when we talk about how the Surgeon General of the United States in 1964 put out a very important warning about smoking. Now, I've talked to people from 1964, and I said, were you really surprised to learn that cigarettes were bad for you? And everybody said, no, we all kind of knew that. But it was really the official word that it was very important that we start taking a stand in the United States against smoking, that how really deleterious it was, what a dangerous practice it was, because according to the Surgeon General, it caused cancer. This is the kind of marker that I think that you're putting down. So let's start kind of with the beginning of the story. You note in your advisory about social media use that 95% of youths between the ages of 13 to 17 report using social media. I mean, 95%. So my first question is, who are the 5% who are not using social media? Yes. Do you know anything about the kids who are not using social media today? What do they have? What's different about them?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And unfortunately, we don't know a lot about those who are choosing not to use social media. We also don't know when they say, I'm not using it, is that a temporary thing? Or is that they've never used social media at all? So there's a lot more that we have to learn. And one of the things that, I underscored in this advisory is the fact that we actually have major gaps, knowledge gaps in our understanding of how social media impacts youth, who's most, at risk for harmful impacts. And part of the reason that we have such a hard time understanding the full picture here is that independent researchers tell me all the time they've not been able to get the data that they need from technology companies, specifically data on the health impacts of their platforms and what it's doing to users, specifically children. And so there's more we need in terms of transparency to understand the answer to some of these questions. But I think it's safe to say that social media use is near universal among children. And it's not only near universal, when you look at how much time it's taking up in a child's day, there are about 2/3 of kids who say that they use social media daily. 1/3 say that they're on it constantly. And we know that the average use is among adolescents is about 3.5 hours per day. The reason that Arthur, is particularly concerning is we also see in the data, publicly available data, by the way, that when kids are using 3 or more hours a day of social media, that's when we see their risk of depression and anxiety symptoms double. So, there is near universal use, but it's also the frequency and the intensity of use that's also a real point of concern.
And we'll talk in a minute about, what the mechanism of action is, what the causation actually is, leading to loneliness, leading to anxiety, leading to depressive symptoms. But let's dig in a little bit to the fact that people are doing something that's objectively harmful for them, according to your best analysis and the advisory that you put out. Just a huge amount of time during the day. I mean, 3.5 hours is a long time to be on Instagram, or, they're not on Twitter. That's all, people our age are on Twitter. But they're on these platforms for a really long period of time. And so that suggests that there's an addictive quality to this product, right? I mean, and of course, that was one of the key things that the Surgeon General talked in the 1960s about when he talked about cigarettes, is that they're highly addictive. They're especially addictive to the highly plastic adolescent brain. And we've subsequently learned that it has everything to do with the dopaminergic pathways in the adolescent brain that are in the process of formation. Tell me about what's so addictive about social media and the parallels between social media and drugs of abuse.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And this is actually a question people ask all the time because they feel like they want to get off of the platforms, but they can't. A third of adolescent girls are saying they feel addicted to social media, and half of adolescents are saying that if they had to get off of it, it would be hard to do so. And by the way, like if we all think about our own experience, I suspect many of us have felt the same way, that we wanted to reduce usage at some point in time, but found it hard to do so. And so I think the one thing that's important to understand is that this isn't happening by accident. Many of these platforms have been designed to maximize how much time we spend on them, because that's often tied to the revenue model. But as a parent, as a doctor, as Surgeon General, what I care about is maximizing the health and well-being of our kids. That misalignment, though, is a real problem. I think the other thing that's interesting is that some researchers have noted that social media use does seem to strongly stimulate the reward center in the brain. And when that center is stimulated to the extreme, it can actually lead to pathways, in the brain that actually mimic what we see in people who are addicted to substances. And, I think this is certainly an area where we need to do more in terms of more research to understand exactly what's happening to the brain and what patterns are emerging, who tends to experience this feeling of addiction more strongly than others. But suffice it to say that there are many people who are finding it hard to stop using social media. And I think when we look at kids in particular, it's so important to underscore that kids are not just smaller adults. They're just at a fundamentally different phase of brain development, of maturity. And they're actually in that phase much more susceptible to the impact of social comparison and social suggestion, all of which, by the way, exists in overwhelming abundance on social media. So I am worried about the impact this is having overall on kids, but I also don't think this is the kind of situation where we can just say, oh, this is a willpower issue. Our kids just need to have more willpower. And if they did, that would be fine. I can tell you this generation of young people has not somehow, inherited a fraction of willpower compared to prior generations. Like they're similar to prior generations. What has changed, it's not the kids, it's the platforms that they're using.
So you believe that it has been purposively drugified as a product to enhance the brain circuits, or enhance this, to stimulate the brain circuits in a way that the addictive properties of social media are enhanced. Do you think that that's the case?
Well, look, I don't think that I presume that the intention of people who develop these platforms in the beginning was never to hurt kids, or to contribute to mental health, ills. But I do think that the models were built around maximizing how much time people spent on them. And the more sticky you could make your products, the more you could make people feel compelled to stay on, the more you could use brain science and behavioral science to design your product in ways that kept people on, whether it was kept them coming back through like buttons, or whether it was using alerts to bring them back to the platform, or those ensuring that kids could use these 24/7 so that they could utilize the platform and be on at all times of day and night. whatever it was, all of these features, along with the infinite scroll and the algorithms which fed content to people to keep them on and keep them stimulated, all of these have led to a circumstance where it is really hard to get off of them. And this is where I worry that in some ways, what we have done is we've pitted our children and parents against some of the best product designers in the world who are using the latest in behavioral and brain science to design platforms that keep people on. And that is just not a fair fight. And we have to recognize that parents and kids need someone to have their back. And it's one of the reasons I issued the advisory, is because I felt that we can no longer just stand by and watch this happen, and we can also, I think, rely entirely on companies fixing it themselves. Social media has been around for nearly 2 decades now, but we really have not seen the kind of progress that we need in safeguarding the health and well-being of our kids, nor have we seen data that tells us that whatever changes or safety-related programs platforms are putting into place have actually had the impact on protecting our kids from mental health harms.
It wasn't that long ago that we were having debates in Congress about whether Joe Camel was a device to market cigarettes to children. You think that something similar, a case could be made that a similar set of tactics are being employed by the social media companies to market to kids, probably because the brain is so plastic and addiction is so much more common?
Well, yeah, look, I think it's the one thing you see with tobacco and the industry recognize early on is that if you get people using cigarettes early in life, they can become lifelong users, right? And there is value in general, more broadly, to getting your product to people at young ages. You have more years of life where they're buying your product, utilizing your services. And so I do think it's not surprising that platforms have, tried to get kids on. I will say, though, that what I worry about is the age of the kids that are being brought onto these platforms. So many of the platforms, for example, have set the age 13 as the threshold beyond which kids can start using social media. By the way, that age 13 is not based on health related guidance. That's not based on the health data. That is based on other criteria. But even 13, even though I believe that is way too young for kids to be using social media in its current form, what we find interesting, Arthur, is that 40% of kids 8 through 12 are on social media. So it's one thing to have rules in place. It's another thing to actually enforce them. And we find that enforcement is certainly not happening effectively from the companies. So whether it's intentionally or not, what we're seeing is that the companies have brought young people onto their platforms, have not adequately policed who is on there. And now we're starting to see more and more data about the fact that many kids experience harms. I do want to acknowledge that some kids do get benefits from social media. They can be an opportunity for them to connect to a broader array of people, find community, express themselves in creative ways. And look, we want to be in a situation where we can maximize those benefits, but minimize the harms. And we've got to look at both, though. And I worry for too long what's happened is, the companies and others have talked about benefits without respect to harms. Like, Arthur, you and I would never recommend that somebody use a medication that, let's say, helps address pain without understanding what the potential harmful effects are, right? And we should be aware of the potential harms here as well, because when it comes to our kids, we should be taking a safety first approach, and safety has not been the kind of priority that it needs to be.
Yeah, and so to begin with, one of the things that, as we'll talk about in terms when we get to the solutions of this problem, is actually enforcing the rules that are in place before we even try to change the rules. And that's all often the case with harmful products and services and phenomena in our society. We talk about what new law can we put in place without thinking about, well, the laws that are already there and the rules that we're not enforcing, of course. So let's talk about what these harms are, because we've talked around the harms a little bit and all that. And there's a lot of interesting research that is now connecting excessive social media use with depressive symptoms and anxiety and even self-harm. And this comes largely from the work of Jonathan Haidt at New York University and Jean Twenge at San Diego State. But to be fair, there are some researchers that say not so fast. But, I, as a social scientist, have reviewed almost all the research on the topic. And I think John Haidt and Jean Twenge's work is incredibly compelling. And I think that your advisory is extremely well-founded and totally responsible. Because if you wait another 20 or 30 years until, as they like to say in the popular press, the science is settled, as far as I'm concerned, we've hit the particular threshold such that we can start talking about these things in this particular way. So, what is the mechanism of action between social media and symptoms of mental illness and even self-harm? How does it happen that a kid is 3 or 3.5 hours using a social media platform, getting a ton of social comparison, maybe being cyberbullied, and actually leading to some form of self-harm or mood disorder? How does that work?
Yeah, so I think we can start by understanding the potential harms that come to kids through social media. And one is that kids can often be exposed to harmful content on social media. That could be extreme violence. It could be sexual content that's inappropriate for their age. They can also be exposed to bullying and harassment, not just from people they know, but from strangers. 6 out of 10 adolescent girls say that they've been approached by a stranger on social media in ways that made them feel uncomfortable. So the bullying and the harassment is also important. The third thing, though, to recognize is that social media can also impact a child's self-esteem in profound ways, not only through the exposure to harassment and bullying, but through the constant self-comparison that takes place on social media. We mentioned earlier that adolescents are particularly sensitive and affected by social comparison. But it's also important to note is that what's different here is the volume of comparison that's taking place on social media compared to real life. So we've been comparing ourselves to each other for a millennia, right? And when I was a kid, we did the same thing. But the difference is that when I was a kid, maybe I compared myself to 20 or 30 or 40 kids who I interacted with in school on a given day, and maybe it's some things I saw in a magazine. But right now, kids often tell me that in a given day, they can sometimes see thousands of images on social media in their feed that they're constantly comparing themselves to, either in terms of people's body image or in terms of the people's accomplishments or what they're doing in their life or the vacations that they're taking. And all of that might seem benign, but when it's at that volume, it really takes a toll on young people. I was just in San Diego, in fact, or in LA rather, not too long ago. And I had a high school senior who told me, she said, I feel great about my day and I feel good about life, but then I go on social media and I check my feed and then, I don't know, I just feel worse. I feel like maybe my life isn't as good as I thought it was. And maybe I'm not doing as much as I should be doing. And that's just an incredibly common experience. But the last bucket to consider in terms of how social media causes harms is what I think of as the displacement model. So it displaces activities in our life that are also health promoting. So when you start to get up to using social media for many hours a day, as so many kids do, again, 3.5 hours on average, but there are many kids who are using social media for 5, 6, 7 hours a day. What you displace critically are sleep, in-person time with friends, and physical activity. And we know that these three are really vital to our health and well-being. So again, a third of adolescents are saying that they're staying up till midnight or later on weeknights using their screens, and much of that is actually social media use. We know that adolescence is a time where you're particularly dependent on sleep for your growth and for your mental health. And kids who are sleep deprived are increased risk for mental health challenges. So you put all of these together, the displacement of health promoting activities, the harassment and bullying, the self-comparison, and certainly the exposure to harmful content, and you start to see how this can have a really negative impact, on children. And again, it's a balance between harms and benefits. But in my mind, the onus really is on the creators of these platforms and the manufacturers to demonstrate safety. And what we have now is the opposite of that, which is growing evidence of harm. And I can't tell you, Arthur, how many stories I hear from parents and kids all over the country who are worried about what they see happening to their kids, who they can't get off of social media, who they see getting sadder and sadder, more despondent about their own lives. But they feel like, and even when the child has insight into the fact that the social media is making them feel worse, they're having a hard time getting off of it for the reasons we discussed earlier. So these are the reason we put out this advisory is to call the country to attention and to action to address this crisis. But you mentioned the 1964 report and how when people were asked around that time, hey, did this surprise you? Many of them said, we kind of had a sense that this was coming. But it was still important for the report to come out because it gave scientific legitimacy to the concern that parents had. And right now, my worry is that many parents intuitively sense that their child's use of social media is causing harm, but they wonder, am I the only one who's feeling this? Maybe it's my fault. Am I not managing this well enough? Am I being a bad parent here? Everyone else seems to be doing okay. At least they're not talking about their problems. So maybe I am, in fact, the only one. But I wanted parents to know that, no, you're not the only one. These concerns are widespread. It is not your fault that you haven't managed all of this entirely on your own. It was an unreasonable expectation of parents. And I want people to know what they can do. So that's why we issued the advisory.
A couple of other effects that we see, so for sure, the whole idea of the content, which can be really problematic, the social comparison, the way that people are neglecting their sleep and their friendships and their exercise. Something that parents describe a lot and that we actually see mounting evidence of is that when kids are getting more and more of the influence from people that don't love them, that don't have their best interests at heart, that the family's values start to become neglected. And so I talk to parents all the time who say, my child is adopting an identity that's really destructive. For example, my child is not practicing her or his religion, which is really important to us because of influences that are on the internet. My child is neglecting a kind of important, healthy, empathetic morality, or becoming politically radicalized, or suddenly incredibly fearful about things that we don't think they should be fearful about. And I mean, look, we can disagree with different parents and their values, but it's a parent's job to impart values to their children, not social media influencers and people who don't actually love the child. So I think probably everybody could argue that that's a really deleterious consequence, is that, strangers are raising your teenager, which is not a good thing. One other thing that's actually emerging in the neuroscience literature is the emerging data on oxytocin. Now, oxytocin, of course, is a neuropeptide that functions as a hormone in the human brain of human connection. So when you lay eyes on your newborn infant, you get it's like the 4th of July inside your head. You remember that, right? When your children were born, and it was astounding. But it only really comes from eye contact and touch with your loved ones. And we crave it. And when we don't get enough of it, we'll try to get it with any source. And one of the interesting bodies of research that I see emerging right now is that social media binging is a response to loneliness, just as eating junk food is a response to hunger. But the calories to nutrient ratio is all messed up. So people will actually get lonelier the more that they binge. So is it fair to say that this is kind of the junk food of social life?
Yeah, that's an interesting analogy, Arthur. And I think there's really something there. I do think that a lot of times kids are driven to use social media because of a need to connect. And the question is it really filling that need in a way that's healthy? Sure, sometimes they can afford short-term connection. In optimal cases, it can lead to great connections and to friendships. But for too many kids, the interaction is passive. They're literally streaming the posts from their friends and their contacts, like in their feed, and looking at that. It's not actual conversation that's happening, but it's the opportunity cost as well. It's about what it's coming in place of. And you said it right, that there is no substitute for a true in-person connection. And because over thousands of years, we evolved not just to pay attention to the content of someone's speech, but to feel their presence, to understand what their body language was telling us, to read their facial expressions, to experience touch and physical human connection. And all of that makes an experience rich. All of that is what contributes to the bond that we form with one another. It's why sometimes you can go back and forth texting with someone for 5 or 10 minutes. And then when you pick up the phone and just talk to them for 30 seconds, it can feel really different. Right. Because it's just different to hear someone's voice. And so I do worry that what many of our kids are getting on social media, and frankly, I would say this is true of adults as well, is a poor substitute for real human connection. And, and I think that has real long-term consequences for us. And, sometimes they can feel more convenient, right? Sometimes it can feel like, well, if I just go online and look at what my friends are doing, it's easier than just picking up the phone and catching up with them. But the truth is, it doesn't give us as much in terms of the human connection and fulfillment that we need. And the truth also is, Arthur, that these are skills that we have to build, talking to people, being in person with each other. And if they don't just happen, on their own, that we have to cultivate those over time. And the less kids have opportunities to be in person with one another, truly interacting, being present with one another, building relationships, then the more those skills atrophy or never get built at all. And that does not serve them well as they get older and go out into the workforce and into society as adults.
So what we're sort of homing in on is the second topic of the conversation I want to bring up in just a minute after we get to some solutions about the social media problem, which is that when people are lonely, they turn to social media, they binge the social media, they get lonelier, and lonelier is at the root of the problem to a certain extent. So we do need to get there for sure. But first, let's talk a little bit about, and by the way, one really interesting thing that you said that I want to emphasize for our audience is that social media, when it's a complement to in-person human relationships, can be great. But when it's a substitute, then you got a problem. And this is sort of the case with any behavior or substance of addiction. And, addiction specialists will say, if it complements your relationship, it might not be a problem. If it substitutes for your relationships, you always have a problem. I mean, if beer is social glue, that's fine. But if you like to drink beer in big quantities all by yourself all night long, that's a dead giveaway that something's up because it's substituting for the love that you actually need. So let's talk about solutions, and then let's talk about loneliness.
Yeah.
So, people talk whenever there's a problem, people like you and me, I mean, we understand that there are problems, but we also believe that the free enterprise system is a good way to organize our economy. And so we don't want to say, well, let's just go rule out entire things that we don't like. We want to find sort of market solutions and interventions by the government that are reasonable. And we want to find non-market solutions to social problems, et cetera, et cetera. So in that spirit, in that spirit of being, reasonable guys, what do you think is the right reaction at this point from the government with respect to regulation of social media, given what you know and what your Surgeon General's report suggests?
Yeah, it's a good question. And what I do think the government has a role to play here, but I don't think the entire problem can be solved by government. I think we need entrepreneurs and families and researchers to step into this space as well. And I can talk a little bit about what they can do. But when it comes to government, I think what government needs to do here is what they did with cars and what they did with car seats and with medications and with baby formula, which is to put in place actual safety standards so that a parent does not have to figure out all the different various standards that should be met and whether a social media platform complies with them. Like, for example, like when one's child turns 15 or 16 and when they're ready to drive, we don't tell a parent, you know what, great, why don't you go inspect that car, make sure the frame is sturdy enough, make sure the tires are good, that the suspension is right, that the engine checks out okay. Why don't you do all that on your own and then let your child drive? Well, you don't do that because that's complex, it's too hard, and it requires expertise that many parents don't have. Here, too, what government can do is establish those kind of safety standards so that the standards that will, number one, protect kids from exposure to harmful content. Number two, will protect their data privacy, which often is not protected. Number three, that will protect them from harassment and from abuse online. And four, that will prevent our kids from being exposed to features that manipulate their minds into excessive use, right? So these are areas where standards can be set and where government actually has to enforce those standards, just like they do with other standards. The other place government can play a role is in requiring and ensuring that we have the kind of data transparency that we should have had for years, frankly, so that we understand as the public, as parents, and as researchers, what the data is actually telling us about the impact on our child's mental health of social media use. Again, researchers say they can't get this data as freely as they need to from the companies. And as a parent, I don't want to feel like things are being hidden from me about products that my kids are using. So this is a place where I think government can step in and play a role. But, I'll tell you, Arthur, what I would love to see is a generation of entrepreneurs who recognize that we can do two things at once. We can build technology, and we can also do so in a way that helps advance human connection and strengthens mental health and well-being. I don't think those two things are in contradiction, but the goal has to be clear. And I have met enough entrepreneurs around the country who are excited and aligned about the role that they could play in advancing human health and well-being, that I think it's, we should be out there supporting them, calling for that kind of, that kind of entrepreneurship and leadership, because I do think there's tremendous innovation, in the world of entrepreneurs and among people across the country that we need to harness now to address the connection crisis, the mental health crisis that we have in the country. And technology, when designed right and used right, can be a part of that solution.
Yeah. One of the things that I've always thought would be helpful is to use the power of private incentive to to solve some of these problems, such that, for example, not necessarily the government level, but the philanthropy level, we should create innovation prizes with the goal of coming up with these technologies. And when they work, then the government can actually implement them at the public policy level. But it's creating some incentives for R&D as a cause for good, as a force for good a little bit. And a lot of people, if there were a $50 million prize to solve some of these big problems, a lot of innovators would be pretty interested in this because, win a massive prize for doing good. Who doesn't want that? So I think that there are ways that we could actually do that, to be sure. And the onus of responsibility can't be on the federal government to come up with innovative solutions. That's not what the government is good at. It's not what the government is designed for. And so being more creative about that. What about schools? I feel like there's got to be something that, and I know you write about this a little bit, but what's your sort of top line thinking about how schools can make this a little bit better and certainly not make it worse?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I say this with, recognize that we've asked so much of schools and of teachers in particular. You're an educator yourself, and so you're very familiar with this. But when it comes to grade school in particular, I think we've put so much on the plates of teachers. But I do think, with the right support, I do think that schools could play a major role here. I think in a few ways. Number one is in education around the impact of social media and healthy social media use, not just for kids, but for their parents who are often struggling for this information. Number two, schools can also serve as a model for how to live our lives and operate without a unhealthy dependence on social media. For example, creating spaces in the school day, that could be much of the school day, where kids have to be with one another, be with their teachers, and would not necessarily be on their devices all the time. That's really important because I talk to so many kids who say, they want to interact with each other during lunchtime, but everyone's on their phones, or even during the classroom. When the class is going on, that kids are on their phones, and after school, kids are on their phones, and even when they do talk to each other, they feel like they're distracted by their devices. So having time where kids can literally be with each other without the distraction of devices is important, and that's something that schools can model as well. The last thing I was just going to say is, and this connects to loneliness as well, is that I think schools have a really powerful role they can play when it comes to social and emotional learning. Right. And when I think about social and emotional learning, I think about teaching kids about emotions, about their emotions and about the emotions of other people, helping kids learn how to manage emotions, and helping them also understand how to build healthy relationships. We think, well, these are things kids should just either know or learn from their families. But the truth is, just the reality is a lot of kids aren't getting this information. And what we're seeing is that downstream impact in terms of loneliness and mental health concerns. So to me, building the kind of skills that help you foster healthy relationships with yourself and others is as important a life skill as learning how to read or write or do math. And so that's why I think that could be a powerful role for schools to play as well.
As a very tangible first item of business, would you, if you could, and the Surgeon General can't do this, but if, maybe in conjunction with the Secretary of Education, you could make a dent in this, would you ban devices from public schools?
Yeah, it's a good question. In our country, much of the authority for making these decisions of what happens in schools rests at the local level with school boards and communities. But if I was running a local school board, or if I was actually more specifically running a school, I would actually put in place measures that would restrict the use of phones and devices during the school day. Recognizing, look, there are times where you want to create some safety provisions in place. So if a parent really needs to reach a child, or if a child is in distress, they know they can reach out to someone, they can get in touch with one another. But I would have times throughout the school day when kids can be kids and can be with each other, because that is really lacking right now.
Yeah. It's notable that the school where I teach, the Harvard Business School, you can't bring devices into class. So, it's arguably the best business school in the world, saying no devices in class, pencil and paper and ears and mouth and mind and heart. That's the equipment that you get. And, that's sort of the point of school, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's important in class. And it's important during social time, during lunchtime. Some of my best conversations I had in school were often during lunchtime.
Yeah.
But I know that
all I remember.
But I know so many it's interesting. So many young people, when I do roundtables around the country, will tell me that it's hard to actually have a conversation with people where they're actually fully present. Like folks are always distracted on their devices. And by the way, it's not just other kids. They often say that about home as well. As much as it's hard for kids to get off their devices, their parents are having a hard time too. And many kids actually say in surveys that they wish that their parents were on their phones less, so that they actually paid more attention to them. So this truly is a societal problem.
Yeah, there was an interesting Pew study that says that the majority of people 16, kids 16 and under, say that their parents are on their phones too much and are distracted. When your teenage kids are saying that you're distracted, there's a problem. It's like your chain smoking, 20-something child telling you need to lay off the cigs a little bit. It's a dangerous business. Or your kid comes home from his university fraternity saying that he thinks you're drinking too much. That's you got issues on your hands. Give the parents who are listening to us one solid piece of advice on what they should do today about social media and the use of social media by their kids.
Yeah. So look, as parents, I think we can play really important roles here, even though all this shouldn't be on parents. I think number one, starting a conversation with your child about how they use social media, so you understand what they're using, how they're using it, and how it makes them feel is really important. I think second, making sure that you create tech-free zones in your child's day is very important. You want to protect their sleep. You want to protect their time for physical activity and their time for in-person interaction. That could look like making meal times tech-free zones, making that hour before bedtime and throughout the night tech-free times as well. And finally, I would just advise parents this. Don't try to do this entirely on your own, but reach out to other parents as well and try to partner with them in these efforts. Because even though you may not always seem like it, most parents are struggling with these same questions of how to manage social media for their kids. And there's strength in numbers here. And as parents, if we can support each other in making some of these choices, creating some of these tech-free zones, and not only is it good for us as parents, it's actually good for our kids because they will also know that there are other kids out there, perhaps in their own school and their own friend circles, who are also, in families where measures are being taken to curtail unhealthy social media use, and they will feel less alone.
Yeah. And one more thing, parents, put your phone away. Put your phone away. I mean, model good behavior. There's a ton of research that shows that it really doesn't matter very much what you tell your kids. What really matters is what your kids see. Yeah. And, if you say you want them to be empathetic, but you're not empathetic, your words are going to be hollow. If you tell them that they shouldn't be spending so much time on social media, but all you're doing is you're tweeting stuff out or, sending photos of your food out to Instagram and, as a 45 or 50-year-old, then that's where the problem really starts. So model the behavior that you want to see. Now, in the time that we have left, I want to get to an earlier concern of yours, or at least one that you wrote about earlier. And when you and I first met is because you came on my podcast to talk about this wonderful book that you'd written about loneliness. You're one of the world's great experts on loneliness. Even apart from your work as Attorney General, you got interested in that in your first pass through Washington. And then you wrote and spoke about that and had a best-selling book on loneliness in your time away from the Attorney General's office. And now you're back and you're linking it up, of course, to the work you're doing on almost everything else. So let's talk a little bit about loneliness and let's start by just kind of giving the top line view. Why are you so worried about loneliness? And when you and I first talked about this, I said, what's the biggest public health crisis in America? And, every time we've talked about that, you didn't immediately say the coronavirus or, gun violence or anything about the climate. You said that loneliness is the predominant thing that keeps you up at night, not personally, but for our nation. So talk a little bit more about that. What is loneliness and why is it such a big problem in America today?
Yeah, I truly believe that this has become the great public health challenge of our time. And I would say, I would even go beyond saying public health challenge to saying societal challenge, because the more you understand about loneliness, as I know you understand so well, Arthur, when we are lonely, it impacts not just our health, but how we function in school, how we perform in the workplace. It affects whether or not we come together in the face of adversity as a community, whether that's a pandemic or a natural disaster. It affects a lot. And I got concerned about this because I was traveling the country in my first stint as Surgeon General and just hearing from people all over America, young and old, who were talking about their struggles with loneliness. They used different words. They didn't use the word lonely, all the time, but they talked about feeling invisible, feeling unseen, feeling like they carried all the burdens in their life by themselves. And as I dug into it, there are two things that became very clear. One is that loneliness is exceedingly common. 1 in 2 adults struggle with measurable levels of loneliness, but the numbers are actually even greater among young people, despite, and perhaps in some cases because of, how much technology they use, social media in particular. But the other thing that became very clear to me, in addition to how common loneliness was how consequential it was. Turns out when we're socially disconnected from one another, it increases our risk for depression, anxiety, and suicide, but also for physical illness, for heart disease, for premature death, for dementia, as well as for a stroke. And I was really stunned when I learned of the data that showed us that the mortality impact of social disconnection is on par with smoking daily. It's even greater than the mortality impact that we see associated with obesity. And smoking, obesity, we think of these as classic public health challenges, as vital to invest in. It turns out loneliness is just as important. So this is why, to me, this has become such an important issue for us to address. It is a quiet epidemic that has swept across America, driven not only by, I think, how we have used technology, social media in particular, but also driven by the fact that for more than half a century, we've seen a decline in participation in faith organizations, in recreational leagues, and other community organizations that used to bring us together. We're seeing so many people who are experiencing trauma in our society, whether that's from violence or from other experiences. And that can often make people turn inward, especially, and shun other people, ironically, exactly when they need other people. And the absence of actually support and, in some cases, counseling and mental health treatment, people can have a hard time breaking out of that. So the bottom line is loneliness has been a crisis that's been growing. The pandemic added fuel to that fire for many people, increased loneliness in many people. But what we're seeing is that if we do not address loneliness, then I worry that it's not just our health that's going to be at risk. It's our ability to overcome the big challenges that are facing us as society right now, whether that's economic inequality, whether it's climate change, whether it's the challenges that we have with racism and discrimination, whether it's other difficulties that we have in the cultural divide that we seem to be experiencing. All of that will be hard to contend with and to address if we can't pull together, if we can't address the disconnection that has seeped into our way of living. And lastly, just consider this. All of us have a relative in our lives who we have fundamental disagreement with, right? Maybe it's political differences, maybe it's differences on other things. We might find them annoying, we might find them disagreeable, whatever it might be. But we also know that if they were sick and in the hospital, we would show up. And if we were sick, they would show up too. The reason we do that is because we have a relationship, and that relationship allows us to transcend our differences. But when we don't have a relationship, those differences can become defining. They can drive polarization. And I worry that when we are increasingly disconnected, as we are as a country, it makes us more prone to division and polarization. And whether that's people trying to foster that kind of division for economic gain or political gain, or whether it's outside actors, in terms of, interests outside the United States that are trying to divide us, whatever it is, those are all more likely to be successful when they're preying upon a population that's divided, where people don't know each other or feel committed to one another.
This is really interesting because, as you know, I've written a whole book called "Love Your Enemies." It's like it's a little on the nose. What the point that I'm trying to get across here, and it has everything to do with the fact that this relates once again to the first part of the conversation. When you are being effectively raised and acculturated by people who don't have your best interests at heart, the outrage industrial complex in politics and media, on campuses, even in high schools, that want to make you afraid of people who disagree with you, that make you want to hate people who disagree with you, who say that political disagreements are effectively denials of your humanity. I mean, the hyperbole that we actually hear, then you will pull away from the people that should be closest to you. Aunt Marge, who, she has a view on the former president of the United States that you find obnoxious, pro or contra, I don't know. But the point being that she's Aunt Marge, and her views on politics are not denying your humanity. They're simple differences of opinion, even if they're vigorous differences of opinion. And you and I have talked about this, and I think it's incredibly important for us to remember that we can't blow disagreements out of proportion. The polarization is actually feeding the epidemic of loneliness. So we're talking about the culture of contempt that pulls us apart, largely and in no small part fueled by social media. This is one of the reasons for the loneliness epidemic. The fact that faith and faith communities are dwindling. Families are pulling apart. I mean, you have fewer and fewer families that live close to each other, and so family relationships have been attenuated. You have tech, which is making us lonely because of the binging on social media and the oxytocin effects and all the stuff that we've talked about. And then, of course, all of this, the accelerant pouring gasoline on all this is COVID. These are, I mean, we don't have to look for a lab leak here, Dr. Murthy. I think we understand what's actually leading to the loneliness epidemic. I mean, it's pretty clear what we're talking about. So, we could spend the whole time on this, and you and I have spent lots of conversations on loneliness in the past. And in the last few minutes that we have, let's just talk about a couple of solutions to this. Then let's start with where it really matters the most, or where it's probably going to be the most effective. What can families do to look after each other better, to decrease loneliness among their teens, their family members, their loved ones, anybody? What should we do as individuals with our families?
Yeah, first we've got to recognize that simply reaching out to one another and reconnecting is one of the most powerful things we can do to address loneliness. It might seem like too small an action against too large a problem, but this is actually how we foster connection. It's through the small conversations where we check on family members, we check on friends, and we help them know that there's no shame in struggling with loneliness, because many of us do. So that's one of the most important things families can do. The second thing that we can all do as families is we can support efforts in our community that bring people together to get to know one another, whether those are our faith organizations, whether those are community organizations like the Big Brothers Big Sisters, or whether it's the YMCA. We can get involved in those organizations. We can start to support and build efforts that bring community members together. My wife is very good at this. My wife Alice, who's a inspiration and teacher for me always, she has done this in our condo building that we live in. She's just decided that there's no reason we all need to be strangers living in this building. We can be a community. We can do it in very simple ways. Just sending an email telling everyone, hey, you know what? Why doesn't everyone come together? Come to the roof. We're going to order pizzas, and everyone's just going to have dinner on a Friday night together. Or hey, why doesn't everyone just come over on a weekend one day and bring your toys and your kids so they can all play with each other? These simple, small acts of community gathering can make a huge difference in how connected we feel. So it's small steps that ultimately will help us stitch together the social fabric of our country. But let me just lastly say this, Arthur, which is that any effort to rebuild social connection in our lives, I think, has to involve us grappling with the core values that we want to drive those relationships. Healthy relationships are not built on convenience or expediency, or they're not transactional. The most fulfilling relationships in our lives, the most healing ones, are relationships that are built on compassion and kindness and love. That's something that you and I both know. You've written about this and spoken about this. It's something that I came to see not only in my own life, but in the lives of the patients that I cared for over the years, who would often talk to me about the loneliness that they struggled with, and who came to reflect at the end of their life on what truly mattered to them. And in the end, in those final days and final hours, what they reflected on was not how big their office was, or how many followers they had on social media, or how much money was in their bank account. They all talked about their relationships, the people who loved them, the people who they loved, the moments of kindness and generosity that they had experienced in their lives. We don't have to wait till the end of our lives to remember that. And I think as families, as faith institutions, as communities, as leaders, and we're all leaders in different spheres of our life, this is a conversation we need to have. It's about the core values that we want to guide our lives, to be the foundation for the society that our kids grow up in. There's too much in our society that tells our kids that success is about being wealthy, famous, and powerful. And we're, as a society, pushing our kids to chase that. But we know that there are plenty of people who are wealthy, powerful, and famous, and profoundly unhappy. People who tend to be happiest are the ones who experience love in their life, who give love, who receive love. And the best way we have of doing that is often in the context of our relationships. So that's why I think this is not only vital for us to focus on, but this is why families have such an important role to play, because they are, along with faith organizations and other core community institutions, the source of the core values that our children inherit, and I hope the source of values that will ultimately guide us in our decision making, not just about our relationships, but about what issues we advocate for, about who we choose to support, about the efforts that we contribute to in our communities.
It's a great note to leave the conversation. To wrap it up, I guess it's a fair summary of your views and mine, that happiness comes from loving and being loved. If you're going to resist something, resist things that make that harder, and adopt into your life the institutions that make it easier. Make sure that you practice it on purpose every single day by loving others, even when they're hard to love, and the reward will be abundant. We'll be taking care of the technological problems we've been talking about, but more importantly, the affairs of the heart that really make us all fully alive. For your work in keeping us not just physically alive, but fully alive as human beings, this is just the best way I can possibly imagine the Surgeon General spending his time, and I'm greatly, I as a citizen of the United States and as a friend, I'm really grateful to you for what you're doing. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Arthur, for those kind words and for this wonderful conversation, and thank you also for your friendship and for being a crusader for love. It's a word we don't talk about often enough, but it's a value that's at the heart of, I think, everything we want in our lives, which is fulfillment, good health, and happiness. So I appreciate all you're doing.
Well, Godspeed. We're cheering for you, and you have millions and millions of people who really need you to succeed. So you can count on our prayers and our thoughts and on all of our support. Thank you for what you're doing. And now it's time for me to let you get back to the work of the American public. Thank you, Dr. Murthy.
Thank you, Arthur. I really appreciate you.
See you later.
See you. Take care.